Hi, I'm Jeff Sachs, a professor at Columbia University, and really pleased and proud to be part of this MOOC on natural resources for sustainable development. And I hope you're having a wonderful time in the course, and I'm grateful for the chance to be able to respond to a lot of fascinating questions that students in the course have been sending in. Of course, we're hearing from students in countries with major extractive industry sectors asking, how do we make this work? What are the lessons of success? Or for a country like Guyana, which has just discovered major new resource finds, how do we not have the resource curse hit our country? Other questions involve the future prospects for the energy sector in general in a world where climate change is the central preeminent concern now. We need an energy system worldwide that is climate safe, and we certainly don't have that yet. So there were a number of questions about the direction of transformation of the energy system. And then a number of people asked about social conditions involving the extractive industry sector. For example, a lot of countries have a tremendous amount of social strife, a tremendous amount of protests or militancy of workers. And some people ask the question of how can a sector survive or even hope to operate if on the one side there are declining energy prices or declining minerals prices, and on the other side there's high militancy, which is causing investors to rethink their investments entirely. So you can see these are fascinating, deep questions, and I will take a few of them and hope to add some information and knowledge about them. So if you allow me to read some of the highlights. One question is, what is your perspective on the trend and rapidity a partial dematerialization of the economy, meaning more services and some goods that use less resources than in the past. This is necessary for sustainable development, and it also has implications for resource-based primary economies. It is fair to say, certainly in energy, water use, certainly in land use, forestry use, we need to get more out of less resource. I hope we're still there. Yeah, just a little flicker of the camera. We need to be able to produce more outputs with less primary commodity intensive inputs. And we know that there are many ways to do that. For example, if buildings are built with better insulation and better design, you can have heating and cooling of buildings with much less energy use. Vehicles can be made lighter and far more energy efficient than they are right now. Crops can use a lot less water. For example, if the irrigation systems are not open field irrigation systems, but are drip irrigation that deliver water directly to the roots of plants. In other words, what economists say often is that you can substitute different kinds of investment, for example, in drip irrigation in place of primary resource use, whether it's primary energy or minerals. This is an important thing to do because the aggregate effect of our use of primary commodities, as you've been studying, has become so big that we are deranging dangerously the climate system. We're destroying habitat massively for millions of species, for example, through deforestation. We are depleting groundwater by pumping water faster from ground aquifers than natural replenishment of that water. And so we have to economize on this primary commodity use. Now, fortunately, technologies exist to do this. Information technologies give us, I think, a very, very big new step forward, because essentially we can now use monitors and meters and micro motors, machinery, other kinds of sensors to really improve the efficiency of resource use, get more for less. And so the information technology revolution will be an important part of this resource saving. Now, what will this mean for primary commodity producers? It could end up, it's not clear, but it could end up meaning that the relative price of mining outputs or fossil fuel energy are hit because the demand for them is being reduced through these technological innovations and through regulations that are limiting the use of the primary commodities. On the other hand, we should reflect on the fact that many of these commodities are becoming more and more scarce relative to a growing world economy. And that, on the other hand, would tend to drive up the relative price of these primary commodities. So I would say that if one tries to forecast the future real price, that is the price of commodities relative to the price of manufactured goods and services, it would be very hard to make a very strong claim that the price is going to trend down or trend up. But I do think what is safe to say, and I'll just end here, is that we both need to reduce the primary commodity usage per unit of output in our economies. In other words, we have to reduce the intensity of primary commodity use, and modern cutting-edge technologies, especially information and communications technologies, monitoring, metering, remote sensing, improved materials, all give us the chance to have that lower resource intensity path of development. Sometimes that's called decoupling, that the economy would continue to grow, but the resource use would actually decline. This is what we want, because we want economic growth, but we can't bear anymore the ecological costs of using resources on the trend lines that we've been using them. So let me turn to a related question. Professor Sachs, you call for an urgent change to a decarbonized, zero or low carbon energy system. And then you point out in this question, the questioner points out that the cost of solar and wind power are falling, but these intermittent energy sources like wind and solar, meaning sometimes the sun shines, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes the wind blows, sometimes it doesn't. Such intermittent energy needs some kind of buffering. For instance, backup batteries or backup gas turbines, something so that in those periods where the intermittent energy is down, the available, deliverable energy to households and businesses remains strong. And that adds a lot to the costs. And so the question is, can we really manage a pathway to deep decarbonization given the high costs of energy storage? As usual, excellent question. The answer is, well, yes, there are many technologies for energy storage. I've already mentioned one, batteries. There are several others that are already used. For example, pumping water back upstream to or uphill to water reservoirs, what's called pumped hydro storage, so that when you have excess energy, the water is pumped to a higher elevation, and when that energy is needed, the water is released and goes through hydro turbines and produces hydroelectric power. There are many other forms of energy storage, chemical or physical storage, also solar and wind power potentially can be stored in the form of synthetic fuels, where sunshine, solar energy, is combined with the CO2 captured from the air, and then through chemical processes is converted, the CO2 is actually converted back into a kind of a synthetic hydrocarbon. So there are going to be many ways for storage. What we know today, and I think this is the gist of the question, is that most of these storage methods are somewhat pricey. So either we have what's sometimes called a base load zero carbon energy source, like hydroelectric power, which is reliable throughout the year, which is true in many places, or nuclear energy, more controversial, but it produces essentially zero carbon electricity as a base load. Either we do that, or we introduce energy storage, such as backup batteries or synthetic fuels, or pumped hydro storage, or similar means. Or a third possibility is to shift our energy demand to make the demand side more flexible, so that various machines and processes are turned on automatically when these intermittent energy sources are going full blast, and they're turned down significantly when the intermittent energy sources are reduced. I could mention and should mention a fourth point, which is that if you're trying to run a grid on wind and solar, for example, if you just have one site that depends on the local wind power or the local sunshine, there could be a lot of vulnerability and variability. But if you are connecting through a big grid, wind in one place, sunshine in another place, and so forth, then the natural variability of all the different geographies connected together on one distribution grid could also tremendously reduce the volatility and mean that even when wind isn't blowing in one place, it is blowing in another place, and give a kind of smooth energy source. Well, these are technical engineering issues. They are economic issues because you have to compare the costs of these alternatives, and they are matters for research and development. And maybe I'll end my comment on this with the R&D issue. We need better batteries. One way is to leave it to the marketplace. Companies that innovate better batteries, if they can win patent rights, for example, will be able to sell those new batteries at a premium to cost, because they'll own the exclusive patent right to them. And that will give an incentive today to inventors to get the job done of improving battery performance and reducing battery costs. But patents have problems. For one thing, they create temporary monopolies so that the company makes money by restricting its supply and jacking up the price. And we don't want that right now. We want a massive, rapid diffusion of low carbon technology as fast as possible, not a diffusion that's held back by an artificial monopoly price of these low carbon sources. So how can you do that? Well, another way to create the incentive for R&D is direct public sector support. For example, the National Science Foundation in the United States, or what was called ARPA-E, which was a technology innovation program, the E standing for energy, where the US government put in funds for private research teams or university research teams to develop improved technologies. We need a global, coordinated R&D effort funded by governments or by public-private partnerships that runs alongside that kind of private market patent-based system. We definitely need to increase the scope and scale of research and development for low carbon technologies, because while we already have technologies that could get the job done, their performance or technical specifications are just not good enough, or their market costs are just not low enough, as much as we need them to be in order to speed the process. So my view is, my recommendation to governments around the world is step up your public financing of research and development, especially at universities or in public-private partnerships that connect private companies with the public sector. There were a number of questions about the resource curse, or the problems that many countries have in actually managing the resource base. One question says that many oil and gas resource-rich countries, example Venezuela, experience struggling economies as a result of the current oil price crisis. That's crisis from the supplier point of view, not the consumer point of view. Did that mean that these countries failed to establish adequate, sustainable practices in their natural resource development? Yes, without question. Venezuela, very sad, very typical of a kind of populist approach to economic management that we've seen many times in Latin America and in other parts of the world, where the government took the big revenues when oil prices were very high, and rather than saving some of them, it spent them, and it said, now we're really going to have increased social spending or increased public investment. And you could understand the motivation, because there's a lot of need for that kind of spending, but didn't take the basic precaution that today's high prices can become next year's low prices. And so you want to smooth the path that when oil prices are high, don't spend all of the money, save some of it for that eventuality when the oil price falls. Then you'll have money in the bank that you can use to keep the public programs going, even when the oil earnings themselves are temporarily reduced. So the basic idea here is to smooth consumption relative to a volatile income stream. So if a country is resource dependent and its tax revenues depend heavily on the flows of earnings from resources, and if those resource earnings depend heavily on the volatile price of commodities, the economic lesson is smooth the spending relative to the earnings. And what countries like Chile, for example, do is to say, we don't just take the current price of copper, our major export, as our benchmark for our earnings, we take a kind of long-term average price. So if copper prices go way up, we don't budget current spending on the basis of those high prices. We budget our spending on the basis of a long-term, more stable average price. And on the other side, when it's a miserable year for copper and the government revenues are low, we have saved up that money from the past so that we don't have to cripple our social programs. We don't have to close down the schools or the hospitals. We've stored up some of our earlier resource earnings. So this kind of consumption smoothing relative to more volatile income is a basic objective of a well-managed resource sector, especially a well-managed resource sector owned heavily by the government, and where the government is dependent on the resource earnings for tax collections. There's another aspect for a country like Venezuela, and that is the following. Venezuela is overwhelmingly dependent on oil exports because it's never worked very hard to promote the non-oil economy. Venezuela has so much oil, and the temptation of politicians is the easy one. Go with the money that you have. That Venezuela, for the decades and decades that I've been visiting Venezuela, now goes back around 30 years of many visits, has never taken the time to develop a public policy framework for a more diversified economy. I begged, I have to tell you, I advise strongly, governments over the years, don't just rely on one export sector. Promote a more diversified economy. Develop the skills, the innovation, the infrastructure, so that the economy doesn't just depend on oil, but depends on other export earnings. Well, Venezuela has not done that, and it now pays the double price of first having highly pro-cyclical spending of government, meaning that when the times are good, you really spend, and when the times are bad, you have to pull on the brakes, even if it creates a social catastrophe. And at the same time, Venezuela keeping so much of its economy dependent on oil. Two big mistakes. And unfortunately, these are predictable. I told President Chavez about this many, many years ago, more than a decade ago. I watched in a lot of unhappiness that the diversification and consumption smoothing were not implemented. Government was impatient. The public was demanding spending. The government provided it, and now Venezuela is in indeed an extremely deep, sad, tough crisis right now. Let me take one more question at this stage, and that is about the social context of the industry. Professor Sachs, how shall we react to militants that keep disturbing the extraction process, negotiate or not? Well, I think always in a situation of conflict, it's really important to try to understand the underlying reasons for the conflict. For example, in many mining sector situations, the mining sector has behaved very badly historically. Maybe it cheated its way in to get a concession, paying a bribe, or somehow getting a concession on hyper favorable terms. Sometimes that concession, that mining concession, came through a denial of rights of indigenous populations that may be resident in places where mining is taking place, but might not be beneficiaries of any of that. Maybe the company has been a huge polluter. You go to mining sites around the world and the soils are poisoned, the water is poisoned, and the cancer rates are super high, and no one's looking after the people because people suffer, they die, but the mining companies make their profits, and that's what they're after. And maybe some corrupt politicians in the country are also paid off, and so they're turning another way. My point is that when you see conflict, there's a history often. The history could be a history of corruption. It could be a history of denial of the community's rights. It could be a history of pollution. It could be a unwise national policy that has taken all the benefits of the extractive sector into a national budget, for example, and left all the problems of that sector with the local community. So I believe very much in what I like to call, it's actually not my term, I got it from my medical doctor wife, differential diagnosis. And for a doctor, differential diagnosis means if you see a crisis, a patient with a fever or a mining zone with high conflict, make the diagnosis of what are the root causes of that crisis. What's the history? What's the background? What are the injustices? If there are injustices, and there often are. And then based on that differential diagnosis, then make a plan of action. So the question asked, negotiate or not? Well, the answer is a very full, it depends. It depends on what is really going on. Maybe the most important thing is for the company to mend its ways, to stop polluting the local environment. Maybe the most important thing is for the company to pay a reasonable level of taxes rather than hiding the income through fancy transfer pricing or use of tax havens or payment of bribes to government officials so that they look the other way. Maybe the problem is that not the company, but the national government and the local community need to negotiate to share the benefits so that the local community is not only losing through pollution, which ought to end, but can win through higher revenues that are shared now between the local region and the local community on the one hand, and the national government on the other hand. When there's a conflict, I believe almost as a basic principle, there is a solution that's better than the conflict, that improves the well-being of the people who are perhaps protesting, as well as enabling the company to make an honest living in the area. But it may mean that the company is told you have to stop the pollution or the exploitation of the local communities. Or the federal government is told you have to share the benefits and the revenues with the local region. These are not simple answers because they depend, just like any individual patient seen by a doctor, they depend on the specific context. And that's why a differential diagnosis is so important, to understand the history, the background, the stakeholders, the pressures, the politics, the geopolitics, the finance. All of those factors are extremely pertinent in coming up with a real solution. But conflict is not a solution. The idea is to make a peaceful resolution in a way that improves the well-being of all of the stakeholders in an ethical, responsible, sound, and sustainable manner. Well, let me thank you for wonderful list of questions. I've used some illustrative questions that help to cover a large number of the questions. There are other excellent ones that I didn't have a chance this time to get to, but I hope that you'll get your questions answered throughout this course. I know that many others will have Google Hangouts that will give you the opportunity to interact. Let me thank you again for the opportunity today. Thank you for joining in by sending questions and by listening to today's question and answer program. Thank you very much, and best wishes to everybody.